Hello my friends, and welcome back to another painting video. And in this video I'm doing something a little bit more special to myself. So this is my old Neferata model that I've used in countless Age of Sigmar battles. She's a little bit battered and bruised and a little bit worn, and she's one of the first models that I ever collected. She's one of the first models I ever painted when I first got into the hobby. And because she's a little bit worn and a little bit battered, I decided to strip the paint off her, give her a little bit of TLC and repaint her up and see what a new sort of lick of paint would look like on such an awesome big model. So if you want to join along with me, you're more than welcome to follow along, paint along, use some of the tips, tricks, techniques, or if you just want to chill out and watch me paint, you're more than welcome to do so as well. So as always, I'm going to start with the skin tones, and for this one, because she's a little bit more of a pale skin being a vampire, we're not going to start by using that sort of deep sort of beige red tone instead. We're going to start with the basic skin tone, so we're using a lighter base colour now. So we're going to use the same kind of techniques, but the base colour is already starting much brighter by being that basic skin tone. And then we're just going to go back in and use the flesh wash like I do, using that flesh wash just to make a little bit of a darkness and just to create a little bit of depth into those recess points and into those areas, just where all the little creases and folds of the skin will be. And we're going to build that back up now by simply going back to the basic skin tone that we started with. So as I said, because we're not using that beige red as the base, we're actually using the basic skin tone. We're actually going to get this character to look a little bit brighter. She's going to be a little bit more pale skinned and she's going to be a little bit brighter, which is great because we're going to make a bit more of a contrast out of this one. We're going to turn her armor quite dark, and by doing so, making this character quite contrasting. Now you have to bear with me with this model. She's already assembled, which is always awkward on these big models to try to paint, but this is the whole point. We're going to try to challenge ourselves, and I'm painting the entire thing using just a brush as well, so this is going to be a real hefty challenge. So if I am struggling a little bit to move the model around, just bear with me. It's just because she's quite difficult to hold on to while she's all fully assembled. So we're going back onto that basic skin tone first of all, and just painting that skin back in, avoiding where the shade is in the recess points. Now from there, using the same technique that I would normally use on a lot of the other skin, we're just going to mix in the highlight into that. So we're using the basic skin tone and the light flesh colour combined together into the first highlight colour. So this is the first step up that we're going to use. And again, you're just using this on where the light is going to catch, so on the top parts of the arms, around the muscle, around the nose and the cheekbones on her face. I do understand, and her face is quite difficult to paint because her face is very small, hidden within that helmet there. So patience is the key when painting her face. Really make sure to take your time and really enjoy it. Try not to overthink it. Try to use a very small brush, and just use the very tip of your brush as well when you're painting just in and around the face and the facial features, because it is quite complicated. It is quite difficult. So just trying to catch the very raised edges of the skin, as you can see, just going across the fingers here, and of course across the shoulder blades and things like that. As I say, don't be too worried about like the face and things. It is quite hard to get into, but if you use the very tip of your brush to do these things, and you use a nice thin down paint, it'll give you a lot more control anyway, so you can build up from there. So as we've done our first highlight with the combination of the light flesh being included, we're now just going to move on to use just that light flesh on its own, and we're doing the same thing again as what we'd done previously. So using a nice thin down paint, we're just trying to catch those raised areas and trying to catch those areas where the light will be sitting on the skin. And because the paint has been thinned down quite nicely, that's giving us a nice even blend. So as I've said to you previously in other videos and things like that, is as your paint dries down, the paint is then going to create this really nice sort of subtle, more eye-catching blend, something that looks a little bit more natural. So again, just using a slight little bit more, so just using that light flesh, and this time I'm adding a very small amount of dead white into that as well. Dead white is one of my favourite colours to use highlights. If you've watched any of my other videos, it's purely just because it's a really nice bright colour, it increases vibrancy and things like that, and it's quite a nice vibrant white. So I'm using this as the most extreme highlight, but again, I'm only using a very small amount of this dead white, because dead white can be a little bit too overpowering. So if you put too much of this in with that light flesh, it's going to be extreme and it's going to look a little bit wrong. And again, with those nice thin paints, it's going to blend into that color tone, into that skin tone, much nicer. So at that stage, that's all of the skin done. So I'm trying to make sure that the skin is quite an easy and simple, quick area of the model, because there's quite a lot of detail on this model as well, and there's a lot to go through. So what we're just going to do is we're just going to start doing all of the base colors then on just Neferata herself. So this area of the video is all about just Neferata, and then we'll do the Bonedragon a little bit later anyway. So we're starting now by using the heavy charcoal, and as I said, because we're using a brighter, more sort of pale flesh color for Neferata, being this pale vampire, we're going to use a really nice sort of dark grey colour, this heavy charcoal, and with doing so we should then end up with a really nice contrast between the light skin tones and obviously this really sort of dark armour. And by doing that, that's going to give us a lot more sort of to look at with our sort of draw your eye in a little bit more, because you're going to notice that skin a lot more. It should pop then on the miniature because of how dark the armour is going to be and things like that. So this is a great sort of way to contrast that miniature and to offset a few little things like getting that pale skin to look a little bit more pale and pop a little bit more. Now for all of the sort of robes and all of the dress and everything that we've got sort of cascading down the side here, which is a really nice sort of way that the model sort of flows down the one side of the Bonedragon. I'm just painting this in a Vallejo red, so this is just a nice flat red colour. Now this red colour is quite, it's not sort of dark, I want to say that it's medium, but actually I think it is probably a little bit darker than that. And this is a really sort of great base color red. This is a red color that I use quite often for things like inside of mouths and tongues and things like that. It's a great way to base your model if you're painting red, is by using this red color, because you can build a lot more tones and a lot more sort of vibrancy up as you go with this color. So this is a really good color to start with. So just painting all of those robes. Now you're going to try and be very careful with the robes. They are quite awkward to get to, especially with this model, as I said, because she's previously been built. She's previously had a bit of a beat in sort of on the tabletop. So we're just trying to build her and paint her, even though she's still assembled. And this is the challenge. So we're going to see how far we get and how good it's going to look at the end, because the end product should in turn look like we've spent a bit of time. You know, it should be worth it. So I'm just using another red there, just on the back of the chair, on the cushions, but I'm using a really sort of dark red for this one. This is a black red colour, and this is just to give it a similar sort of colour, so keep in with that red colour scheme, but not making it all too uniform, so just trying to break things up and have a little bit of a subtle difference as well. Moving on to one of my favourite colours again. This is from Citadel range though, so this is a Retributor armour. And again, because I said about that armour being so dark, by having that dark heavy charcoal colour, we're just using sort of this Retributor gold colour just to catch some of the real edges and some of the real details. So again, that armour is going to be really dark, but with some really great sort of subtle bursts of colour, which is just going to make it catch your eye a little bit more and break up all of that sort of dark tone. And again, that contrast then between the light, the dark, the metallics, and the matte sort of the matte sort of grey colours and black should tie everything together, should make everything look really nice. I'm just trying to be careful across the back of the helmet here, because there's a few little details that we're painting with the same gold. And you can see I've done the same just underneath the, around sort of the chest area as well with the gold. Now carrying on with the helmet, we're just building up all of these bone areas. Now you could paint these gold as well if you want, but instead we're just going to go with something a little bit more sort of traditional. So we're painting these a little bit more sort of bone colour. So I'm sticking with my bone white again, a very common colour that I use in my palette to paint these kinds of things. This is a great colour in terms of it being a creamy white, so it's not too white, it's not too extreme, and it's something that you can build up on really well. This is a colour that's going to feature quite heavily when we painted the Bonedragon towards the end, and you'll see kind of a few different techniques when I'm painting that Bonedragon and how we're going to get that to really burst and really pop as well, to make the model look amazing. And then again for the chair, I'm just painting this one in a Stonewall grey, so this is just a very run-of-the-mill everyday mid-range grey, and again that's purely just not to take any of the colour or any of the sort of draw your eye away from Neferata herself. We kind of want something a little bit, not kind of boring, but just plain enough that she's the focus of attention, or the dragon is the focus of attention, and things like that. So just going with a nice basic sort of stonewall grey, a nice run-of-the-mill grey. And just underneath, for this I'm using a dark rust, again one of my favourite colours. This is a great colour, this is like a dryad bark from a citadel and things like that. So really sort of dark brown. So I'm painting this almost as if the seat is sort of mounted on top of a leather, almost like a leather sort of like a saddle. There we go. I got to the word in the end. I'm sorry. So we're just going to paint it as if it's on a nice leather saddle. And then we're just going to go around. I'm going to paint some of these areas in silver. Now, so I'm just painting the pommel of the dagger. I'm painting some of the little details and gems on top of Neferata's head and things like that with the silver. We're going to go over those later. But we're just base coating them in silver for now because we're going to use a technical paint on them a little bit later. And we're going to do the same with these jewels just down the side of her dress and cloak and things like that. Just painting these in a nice gunmetal. Gunmetal is a great base colour silver because this is quite a dark silver, so this is a really good way to start because you can always lighten that up with lighter silvers a little bit later. Now, once we've done all of those base colours on Neferata, we're now going to use a Citadel Null Oil wash. And you're just going to be very careful with this. As you can see, I'm being a lot more careful than I normally am with this because we don't want this to go a little bit too extreme. We're trying to manipulate this so that it sits in the recessed points. We're trying to manipulate this a little bit better than just throwing it onto the model and things. We kind of want this to sit just in those areas where the folds of the dress go, down in between sort of the plates of the armour and things like that. And we're trying our best to avoid catching any of the skin or hitting any of the skin because we don't want to darken any of that down. It's just going to try to be as careful as possible. But we're going to cover everything that we've done apart from the skin in this colour because this is going to help to just darken things down slightly, and then we can build those colours back up. And the red, by the time we get to the end of building up the red on that cloak, she is really going to stand out. That red is going to really be like a lavish red. It's going to be a really nice sight. So again, just doing the same all across the helmet, same across the bone colour and things like that as well, and just across the armour. Again, just trying to be very careful here, not to hit the skin and not to catch any of the wash on the skin. Can be quite complicated, again, as I say, because she's pre-built and she's already on the mount and things like that. Now, I did try to take a look at taking her from the mount, but again, because this was one of the first ever miniatures that I had built in my haste, I actually just assembled her as quickly as I possibly could. I'm thinking about it going back. I'd probably, if I'd done it again, magnetize her so you could have the best of all three of the models together because it's 3 different Mortarchs that you could use. But again, hindsight is a wonderful thing. So once all of that is dried down, we're going to start by going back and rebuilding the armour. So we're going back to that heavy charcoal first. And the heavy charcoal, what we're going to try and do is just build that on the plates, so just across the plates of the armour. And you can see even across the midriff and the sort of stomach area and things like that, you can see that the armour is in plates and it is layered. And what we're trying to do is we're just trying to paint this across those layers and across those paints, but while leaving the darkness of that null oil wash sitting in between those cracks, so that again it's creating that depth and building a little bit of depth between those areas. Now I'm using a new paint here that I've used this once before, and this is a somber grey, and this somber grey is a really nice grey. It's quite a bluish grey, and it's a lot lighter than you'd think, so you only need to mix this in small doses. So I'm mixing this in with a 70-30, so I'm just putting a small amount into our original heavy charcoal, just to boost that up by a stop, so just to get that vibrancy up a little bit. So as we paint in the armour now, we already sort of increase in that vibrancy, so we're not so dark. We're still a dark grey, but we've just got a little bit more of a sort of a lighter tone sort of showing through now and building up as well. And again, what we're doing is we're building this onto those plates while avoiding any of the recessed areas, avoiding any of the areas where it's the darkest, so just in between those cracks of the plates and things like that. And by doing so, we build in that illusion of depth. Now, as I say, because this does lighten things up quite a bit, we're building this up in stops. So I went in for about a 70-30 split. So this was just putting a little bit of that somber grey in. Now this time I'm going sort of half and half, sort of 50-50. And you can see already that it's starting to lighten things up quite a bit. And what you get with this is, again, because we're using thin down paints, because the paint is thin, it looks lighter originally when it goes onto the miniature. And then it'll dry down a little bit darker anyway. But by using those thin paints, it gives us the ability to manipulate and control where this is going. And as you can see, I'm just trying to use the very, very tip of the brush, especially in and underneath around sort of the chest plate and the sort of armor and things around her stomach and middle area, because it's very, very tight to get in there now. And as you can see, I'm just building that armor up and building that color up, just like so. Now, once I've got to that level, I'm just using that somber grey on its own, and I'm just using this now to do the very, very edge highlighting. Now, the shape on the armour plates on this model, because they come to such extreme points just around the feet and down the shin guards and across the sort of armour plating, as you can see, just across the middle section of the armour on Neferata herself, it means that it's perfect to do this sort of like really sort of extreme edge highlighting. So just by adding a real small hint of this somber grey, it's just picking out on those extreme edges and just making that colour and that armour seem a little bit more, like adding more of that depth and just making that edge stand out a little bit more. Again, it catches your eye, it makes it look a lot sharper, and it makes the armour look a lot sharper and a lot more sort of brighter in some ways, or catching the light in some ways, which is great. As I said, just trying my best to use the very tip of my brush across the midriff. This is probably the hardest area, or one of the hardest areas that I found to paint her while she was assembled. But the whole point of having a good challenge like this is to really push your boundaries and try to do something that maybe you wouldn't normally do. And something like this, painting her as she is built, I probably wouldn't do that again now, because, as I said, hindsight is great. And now that I've learned so much through my hobby and over painting for the last few years, I would probably paint her away from the dragon and paint them separately and then glue them together a little bit later. And by doing so then, giving yourself more option and more control, and not stressing yourself out. You're trying to get the brush into all those really difficult nooks and crannies and things like that, which is really hard to get to sometimes. So yeah. Now, once we've got all of the armour is painted, and as you can see, those little edge highlights are really sort of catching the light now and making those little boots and the shin guards and things like that really stand out and look amazing. We're just going to go back to that retributor armour again, so just back to that gold, and we're just picking out now some of the edges again, just to add a little bit more flair and a little bit more colour and a little bit more vibrancy to it. And once that's dry, we're going to go back and we're just going to use a small stippling effect, and the stippling effect is just by dabbing the very edge of the brush, by using a polished gold. So the polished gold is by the Vallejo instead of the Citadel, and this one now is just the brighter sort of gold, and this one will catch the light much sharper. So again, it's building that vibrancy and creating that sort of metallic effect out of the model. And as I say, I'm just stippling this on because with some things like metallics and things like that, you don't want them to look perfect, especially if it's for something that's like a warrior or something that has been in a battle and things like that. You don't want everything to be perfect. You kind of want a little bit of a beaten and worn look as well. So once the gold has dried, we're then going to move back on to building up these areas of the bone. As you can see, I'm just using, again, the very tip of the brush, and I'm just trying to catch all of those areas of the bone that are sticking out now. And this is great because this part of the model, you can really see where that Nuln Oil wash has sat into those creases so that it's creating that darkness and that depth. And as I'm just catching the tips and the edges of the bone, you can see that vibrancy building and that depth and tone sort of being created throughout. And this is great because this is what we want. Again, that light areas, those light points that stand out against that dark armour then, so it's creating a lot more depth and a lot more sort of character that we're planning on painting. Now, being very careful on the very front of the helmet here, because the last thing you want to do now, after doing all of that armour and all of those greys, is to get the bone white in between these little cracks. So again, using the very tip of the brush, bit of patience, taking your time, and just following along those raised areas, just like so. And then it was inevitable. It was at this moment where I dropped Neferata and her head accidentally fell off. As I said, this is a already beaten and worn model that has seen a lot of battle. So I had to use a little bit of super glue and get her back up and running so that we can continue on with the video. But she's okay. She's okay. She's a vampire. She's okay. It's fine. She's absolutely fine. She looks great. No harm. You could never tell that her head fell off, other than the fact that I've told you guys her head fell off. Now, one thing I would say, this model is quite big, so the base is quite big and it's quite unwieldy. It's quite difficult to move around. So a good painting handle, some of the bigger painting handles would probably come in handy for this. I only have the smaller painting handle here, but after painting this and seeing how difficult she was to sort of move around and paint, especially like this, I'm seriously looking at a proper painting handle now. So yes, as I say, her head's on, she's fine, there's nothing wrong with it, she looks perfect. She's absolutely, she's good to go, right? So we're going to continue. So moving back onto the red, and we're building up on those, the dress area and the flowing clothes that are coming down the one side now. So we're just building that red back up. Nice thin coats again, as I said, because we're going to build this up, and this is our base color. Now for this, to get the red to really pop, what I'm going to do is, I'm actually going to do a few different stops. So I'm going to build this up a few different stages, and by doing so, we should have a really nice blended even transition that should look really cool and really sort of bloody and really sort of vampiric. So we should have a really cool looking cloak that looks the part, that looks suitable for a good vampire queen. So once we've used our normal red, we're going to use a mix of the normal red again and a carmine red, because the carmine red is slightly brighter, or it's got a slight different vibrance to it. So we're going to build this one on top, because this is giving us our initial transition. So that initial transition between the base color and then the next highlight, this is the perfect sort of blend that I found so far to build these sort of colors up as we go. And as you see this cloak sort of growing in color, you'll kind of see what I mean. Carmine red mixed with the normal red is a really good way to build those colors up. And as you can see, by using the thin down paints, you can see how we're building on that vibrancy, and you can see how we are just sticking to the very top areas, leaving sort of the darker points in those recess bits, in those folds, in the areas where you want the shadows and things to be left. So we're only painting sort of the highlighted areas, the areas where the light would catch on mostly. And for now, I'm painting along with it. So I'm painting in straight lines down the cloak. So I'm following the cloak. And I'm following the cloak to kind of match the cloak's fluidity when I'm painting it. And the reason for that is because I don't want it to be like if I paint across the other way. So if I painted it sort of horizontal rather than vertical, you kind of get like different brush strokes. Whereas if we leave a few brush strokes and the brush strokes are in by painting straight down as we are, it's going to add to the folds, and it's going to add to the depth, and it's going to add to the quality of the way that the miniature looks deeper and looks more like natural folds in the cloak then. I'm showing you a prolonged bit of me painting the cloak here, just to give you an idea as to how it is a long process and it does take time, but it is worth spending a bit of time, because by the time we get to the stage towards the end where it's going to look really sort of vibrant and good, it's something that you could be proud of then, because you've spent quite a bit of time getting to that stage. So the next area that we're going to use, or the next highlight we're going to use, we're just going to use that carmine red on its own. And as you see for this one now, I'm starting to use a stippling motion instead of the direct straight brush motion. So I'm using a slightly older brush here, one that does spread out and open up quite a bit when I'm painting. And the reason for that is because we don't want the stippling effect to be perfect. We kind of want those bristles and bits of the brush to be all over the place. We don't want it to just be directed in one sort of patch and in one sort of area. And I'm just trying to stipple this colour and stipple this highlight all the way around, again on those edges, on the extreme points that are poking out. And what we're doing by stippling this is we're creating kind of a texture. And that texture is going to give you again, so it's going to give you that darkness showing through, then that sort of first highlight showing through, and then this is going to give another highlight, but it's not going to be perfect. Like I say, it's going to create a texture. And that's going to add more character as well. So just keeping up with this stippling effect. So we're just trying to keep this, as I said, building this character. So add into the character by just dotting this colour around. And we're just using the carmine red just on the edges, and as I said, on the very, very sort of tips of the folds of the cloth, so that it's always going to be on the brightest areas where the light is catching. And we mix in then again, as I said, we're going up on this cloak in multiple stages, and there is a reason for that, and it's just about building that transition through. So we're going through quite a lot of different transitions and quite a lot of different shades of colour for this one, so that this becomes a much more natural and vibrant sort of like cloak or dress or anything like that. So that's what we're trying to achieve by building so many different layers. So this time we're using the carmine red, and we're mixing in another one of my favourite colours, which is the bloody red. Not only does it sound good, not only is it great to say, but it also looks really good as well, because the bloody red is a very, very vibrant red. And by mixing the bloody red in with other reds, you always get this sort of immediate pop and this immediate sort of colour burst on top of what you've already painted. And again, by using thin layers, this is going to blend into a nice smooth transition as well, which is going to give us a lovely build-up of that colour tone, but without going too over the top, too extreme, and leaving too many splodges and things like that around. So once we've got to that stage, we're just going to use the bloody red on its own. And again, not only does it look good, but it's great to say as well. And we're just using that bloody red now, just on the very, very edges and just on the very, very tips now. So we're not going quite as extreme as some of the other colours. We're just using this as far in onto those edges and those folds as we possibly can. And again, with this being thinned down, this is going to blend smoothly into those colours below, which is fantastic. That's exactly what we want. And once all this dries together, it's going to create a really, really, really nice looking dress that is fit for a vampire queen. Like I say, we've done so many different colours on this, or so many different transitions of colour on this, but that's kind of what we want. We want it to build up into a natural transition, but we also want that colour to really, really burst on the model, because that's supposed to be one of the focus points. Her red flowing dress is going to be a real focus point and a real feature on this model as well. It's something that when your friends see it, and when you look at the model when it's sat on your shelves in your display cabinet, you're really going to notice that red, that vibrancy, and that sort of blood-coloured cloak that she's got, sort of sort of going down the one side of the Bonedragon as well, which is really, really cool. So again, I'm just trying to use that bloody red, and I'm just trying to be as careful as possible, especially on those parts of the cloak that are coming down from her arms. So I'm just trying to catch as much of the very edges of those folds as possible. If you've seen some of my other videos and you've seen me painting sort of bone colours and things like that before, you'll know that I've got a favourite highlight to that bone white. And my favourite highlight is this elfic flesh. And this is a really smooth transition colour, because again, this is also a creamy white. So this is a really good colour to build on top of that bone white. This has a really good vibrancy again, so it gets the sort of cream bone colours to really stand out, and the vibrancy to really look good. So you just want to carefully put this across sort of the wrist guards and across the helmet and across the parts of the helm up there as well. Well, once you've done that bit, we're just going to move on to the seat then as well, so the chair. And as I said earlier, we're just using a very basic colour for the chair. We don't want it to be too extreme and detract from all that red and all that effort that we've done on the red. And you can see the folds of the red just on the front side of the dress here as well. You can see where I've built those tones through in the same way as what we've done the other side. And it looks fantastic now. It's starting to really, really come together. So for this, I'm trying to make this really scratchy. So by using that Stonewall Grey, again, it's thinned down. And what I'm trying to do is just use that stipple and scratches and things like that to kind of make this chair look sort of old and worn. We don't want the colour to be really perfect. I don't want this to be really sort of like one flat colour and one flat tone and things like that. I'm trying to keep where the shade is sat in the recess points, and then we're just trying to scratch it up and put the stippling effect on it and make it look worn and battered and beaten and all these different things. And you can see I'm just using sort of like scratchy techniques across the back of it here as well. And it's just all about creating that character and creating that depth to the model. Because the last thing we want is just one flat colour, especially on an area so close to Neferata herself, where she is already looking really impressive with that amazingly vibrant cloak. So you can use a little bit of dry brushing on this if you want. If you feel more comfortable doing that, that's absolutely fine. I tend to go with like really scratchy sort of effects and stippling effects and things like that, because I find that these kinds of things help to sort of wear things out and make things look a little bit more worn down and beaten up and things like that. So we're just using that dead white again, my favourite sort of highlight, and I'm adding a little bit of that dead white into the stonewall grey. We're roughly around about 50-50 this time round, and I'm just using this again just to do some extreme edge highlights. So I'm just edging around and highlighting the very edges and just going around the chair itself, just adding a little bit of scratches and scrape lines here and there across the chair as well. And that's going to be the quickest and easiest way that I can think of sort of like building this chair, but without spending too much time on it, because we don't kind of want the chair to take away from Neferata herself and things like that. You could always do this like the bone colours in the same way as you've done sort of the helmet if you wanted to, because he can be quite bony and things like that. But I've just stuck with grey for now and tried to sort of make it something a little bit different by doing so. Now, we're going to move on to the blade. Now, by moving on to the blade here, I'm going to use a very similar technique. I'm going to use the same technique that I've done by painting power swords. So in one of my previous videos where I painted power swords by using a mixed blend, I'm going to do the same thing here, but I'm going to do it a little bit quicker. So if you would like to spend a bit more time and learn how I've done this, check out that other video and you'll see me spending a bit more time going through it. But pretty much that's all you're doing is you're starting by base coating with medium blue. So you're base coating the middle colour and the middle tone. And then you're using your darker shade just in either side, and then you're just going to use a highlighted shade either side while the blade and the paints are still wet, so you can see that I'm blending those colours together. So the highlights and darks are kind of blending together, and we kind of getting extreme highlights on one side, extreme darks on the other, and we're just kind of blending it together so that it will kind of dry together into this sort of nice even blend. And once that is dried, then we can sort of like manipulate and do some extra bits on top. So while I wait for that to dry down properly, because once you do these blends, you kind of need them to dry down properly before you add like the final touches, I'm just going to go around and just add some of the brighter silver to these little tassels that we've got hanging off the dress. So we're just using the silver now. So we've gone from the gunmetal, and now we're just using the silver, which is the highlight one. And this one really pops, this one really stands out. This is a very bright and vibrant, shiny silver. And this one is just going to catch the light as you turn that dress and things like that as the model twists. So now that we're happy and we know that the blade is dried, I'm just going to move straight on to using the final vinyl touches. And for this I'm using the interactive, AK interactive paint. And I have a pastel paint set here. And these pastel colours are fantastic for this sort of thing. They're really vibrant. They have light colours in them, so they are a blue colour. But it's almost like a white blue, like a really light electric blue, and that makes it perfect for doing these really extreme edges, as you can see. So we're painting these scratches and scrapes down the blade and just going around the very edge of the blade as well, and that's creating this kind of magical weapon effect, making the weapon again look beaten and warm, but almost quite magical, almost like it's made of a material that is otherworldly and sort of ghostly and things like that as well. So making this into like a magical dagger. And finally what I'm doing is I'm just using a very thin coat of the ultramarine blue, and what I've done is I've thinned that down so much that it becomes a glaze. And I'm just manipulating that colour as a glaze to just tie some of those colours back together, because I don't want some of those highlights to be so extreme. So it's just tying those colours back together. And we're doing the same thing just on the cushions on the back of the chair. And this I found really difficult to get in sort of line for the camera properly. But pretty much that's all I'm doing is using the very tip of the brush. And I'm using that black red. And I'm just using the tip of the brush to just dab on the areas of the cushions that are poking out. So you should have little bumps and little folds and things like that where the cushions are just sticking out. And that's all I'm doing is just using the very tip of my brush to just dab on those little bits of cushion. And then for one of the final stages, I think, of Neferata herself, we're going back and we're just doing the leather on the The saddle. It's the second time that I couldn't work out the saddle. So I'm just painting dark rust and leather brown, half and half. And I'm using, again, this really rough stippled effect, scratchy sort of paintbrush effect. Just kind of making it look really sort of rough and worn and scratchy. And now once that part is dry, I'm just going to go on and use just leather brown. And again, this is nice and thin. And this is quite a vibrant colour. But when it's nice and thin, this will boost that colour and it will create sort of a nice leather effect. And what I'm trying to do is, I'm looking at this thinking, I want this to look battered and worn. So I'm just using really, really, really quick, vibrant, fast-moving scrapes and scratches. So this is going to create a worn-out leather that's got sort of like natural scrapes and scratches across it, as you can see. Just kind of doing a cross-hatch effect across it and leaving some of that underneath colour showing through. And where we stippled underneath as well, that's going to give that extra depth as well. And that should be Neferata finished. Now, while Neferata is finished, we're going to move on to painting now all of the Bonedragon and the ghosts and the spirits. So for this is a very time-consuming part of the model, but it is very rewarding because it will look amazing when you get to the end. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just painting ghost grey across the spirits across the bottom, and I'm just painting ghost grey across all of the skulls. Now this was one of the harder parts I found to do because the skulls do riddle all the way through the inside of the bones, as you can see here. So the bone areas and the skeleton of the Bonedragon actually do wrap around all of the different skulls. So I found this probably one of the more difficult and time-consuming things to do. And as I said earlier, I'd probably, if I had to do it again, or if I was going to paint them again, I'd paint them separately. And this is one of those main reasons, is because trying to paint all of these things while Neferata is sat on top of the Bonedragon, and she's completely painted, so you don't want to get any paint on her, it becomes a lot more stressful trying to paint all of these areas. But as I said earlier, this is going to be a challenge, so we're challenging ourselves to get better and to paint a little bit more extreme, and of course to make her look a lot better. Now, once you've done all of the ghost grey, I'm then moving on and I'm using a verdigris glaze. Verdigris? Something like that. So we're using this verdigris glaze, and this is a really sort of great sort of colour for doing things like battered, sort of old, worn, metallic sort of bronzes. But this also lends itself into creating really sort of spooky looking ghosts and skeletons. I've done a really quick short video on how I painted the spirits and my spirit hosts using the exact same formula as this. So if you want to see a really quick way of doing it, you could jump on and just check that one out whenever you're ready. Now, once that is dried, what I'm doing then is I'm just going back, and this is where I said this area of the model takes a lot more time, and I'm just painting using dead white on its own, nice and thinned down. I'm just going to start painting those skeletons back in. So we're picking out all of the details around the eye socket, around the nose, the teeth, painting the top parts of the skull, so that with this being thinned down, it's going to have a nice smooth transition between the glaze and the white. But by doing so as well, it's making those skulls really pop and look a little bit more ethereal. So if you just leave it with the glaze, that's cool and that's absolutely fine. But when you do this, this just kind of finishes those skulls off and makes it a little bit more ghostly and a little bit more sort of spiritual and things like that, which is kind of what we're looking for, you know? So it does take a lot of time, especially doing it in between all of the bones and things like that, but it is worth it. It will pay off in the end, because when you look back on the model, you're going to be really, really proud of how it looks. And again, we're doing the same thing with the spirits, around the nose, around the eye sockets, just following down some of those little bands across the head, as you see. So some of the real sort of spiritly effects, and we're just catching the very, very raised areas, creating that element of character and that depth between sort of the glaze and the colour showing through, and the white side of it being sort of spiritual and ghostly and things like that, all sort of rolled into one. It's a really, really cool, simple effect. It's not something you need to spend ages on doing, but it looks really, really, really good when it's done. And as you can see, I'm just trying to build it up in stages and just kind of getting a feel for where the white should go. So you don't want to kind of overdo the white. I kind of show you what I mean in here. So you're going to try and paint the white just across the skull, across the nose, and just across the front parts there. But we're trying to leave that glaze, you see, in between the bones, trying to leave as much of that green in as well, so that it gives that element of colour and depth, and, as I say, the ethereal nature of it and things like that. So just trying to give you an idea as to how I've built this up and how I've created this effect. And as you can see, it's all just using, again, the very, very tip of the brush. And that's great, because once that area is done and once that step is done, we then onto all of the bones. And all of the bones, as you see me paint bones countless and countless and countless times before by watching some of the other videos, and by seeing the way that I painted bones with Neferata herself, we're going to base the whole thing in a bone white. This was a real challenge to do with a paintbrush, but it will look amazing when it's done. So what I've done is just tried to water the bone white down, and the thing with bone white and sort of creamy white colours like that, once you water them down so that you get more paint, so that the paint moves quicker around your brush, they tend to thin a lot more. So you have to put 2 or 3 coats on, maybe even 4 coats on, to get the right consistency that you're looking for. And that's difficult, especially going around these sort of rib cage areas, the bones that are covering the skulls. So you just want to be as careful as possible not to get that bone white now on top of those skulls. So you just want to take your time going around those areas, especially where the skulls are. Now, just to make the claws look slightly different and look a little bit more interesting, I've actually painted those in a Vallejo khaki colour, and that's given them a slightly different colour to the actual main bone colour and bone structure of the model. By using this little khaki colour, all we're going to do is we're going to separate that colour from the bone white. And although we're going to put another wash on and we're going to use a really nice sort of like brown texture just here. So we're going to use the Vallejo Dip-In Formula Game Wash Sepia. But what I've done is I've used a flow improver on this. Because this colour can be quite extreme or quite harsh, what I've done is I've used the flow improver to try to manipulate this colour a little bit more so that it's not so extreme and it's not so harsh. So the sepia tone then becomes a light brown colour, which is going to be great on those bones, because once this dries down on those bones, it's really going to make the bones look a little bit more old and a little bit more ancient then, rather than just flat bone colour. Again, got to be very, very careful using the tip of your brush to get the wash into some of the areas, and just kind of watching where the wash is sitting, because the last thing you want to do after doing all of those skulls and all of those ghosts is having that dark brown sitting on, or this sepia sort of tone sitting on those skulls. Now if you do get a little bit on there and you're following sort of the style of painting that I'm doing, that's fine, because you can use that white colour to sort of build them back up anyway. So don't worry too much if you make any mistakes. Part of learning is making mistakes, and part of the fun of painting is making mistakes as well. If you don't make mistakes, it's not as much fun painting, because you learn from those mistakes and you get better and you improve. So just try to take your time and be careful. And as you can see, that sepia colour now has turned into a really, really sort of like light sepia brown tone. You can see how sort of old-fashioned and ancient the bones look. And what we're going to do is we're going to build that colour back up. Not entirely, because where some of that wash has sat, we kind of want that brown and that sepia tone and that old-fashioned looking colour to stay there. So we start in by going back with that bone white again. And with that bone white, we've thinned this down now, because as I was saying, when you thin this colour down, it does sort of show through a little bit more of the underneath colour, and that's exactly what we want. We want this nice and thin so that some of that sepia is still going to show through, and that's creating then more depth, more tone, and more character on the bones of this model, and this Bonedragon is going to look insanely cool. So it's going to look really, really cool when we get to the end. Again, it's a long process, especially when you're doing it with a brush and not an airbrush, but the reason why I wanted to do this was to show you that you can do it with a brush. Brushes are still able to get some really cool effects and make some really cool sort of painted models. It just takes time and a little bit of patience and some cool techniques along the way as well. And also I wanted to challenge myself to see sort of how far I'd improved in painting since I started painting, because with this being one of the first models I painted, I felt really overwhelmed by this model, to be honest. She was way above my skill level. So I wanted to kind of give you guys an idea as to how you can paint this in stages without feeling too overwhelmed, without feeling like it can't be done, because it can be done. It can be done with a brush, as you can see. It just takes time, as I say. So building that bone white, and I'm spending a bit of time showing you me painting the bones, just to give you an idea as to sort of the brush strokes and how thin the paint is, and when I'm trying to leave some of the sepia wash in some of those gaps as well, on purpose, just to kind of build that character. And as I say to you quite often, is just building that depth and building that depth. The more depth that you get out of the miniature, the more depth you get out of the model, the more kind of character and the more realism and the more sort of the nicer it is to look. So it's more impressive on your shelf then when you can get that contrast and that depth. So as you can see, just using very, very thin brush strokes, just trying to leave, as you can see, some of the shade and the colour from underneath is already showing through because the paint is thin, and we're trying to leave as well, especially in those little areas where there's little holes and bits on the bones, which make the bones really look like they've got a lot of sort of brittle areas to them, trying to leave the wash in those as much as we possibly can so that it builds on that. And again now, just showing you just down the rib cages, because again this can be something that you feel a little bit overwhelmed with, really worrying about getting that bone white on those skulls and things like that. But you don't have to worry too much. Just take your time, and as you see, using the tip of your brush. Don't forget, when I do these videos, I do speed up the painting process, just so that you guys get a feel for how I'm painting. But actually, I'm painting this much slower than it looks. So again, just take your time. Don't feel rushed. Don't feel like you've got to get to the end stage straight away. It's always like painting is about the end result, sure, but it's about how you get there as well. You don't have to rush your way through, panic over things, paint over things. Take your time, enjoy it. The more you enjoy it, the better the model is, and the more you're going to appreciate the model sort of on your shelf, or when you're playing the game, you're going to have a connection to that model because you spent time painting that model and making it your own. And that's kind of what you want with your hobby, you know? So again, just showing you some of the brush strokes, and what we're doing now is exactly the same as what we've done earlier. We've done the bone white, and the bone white's dried, and we're just moving on now to the elfic flesh, which is that natural highlight that I was talking about. This is also that creamy white, and it's a nice highlight. And this time, I'm painting on top of that bone white, but I'm not covering all of the bone white. And you can see I'm using and leaving certain scratches and scrapes and brush strokes and things like that, because it's adding to that depth, adding to that character, adding to the fact that these bones are old and, you know, sort of the ancient, you know, it's not something that's brand new and perfect. And that's kind of what you want, especially when you're painting with a brush. You don't want everything to look the perfect blend and things like that. Well, I suppose you can do, but it's entirely up to you. It's all about style and personal preference and the way that you paint and things, you know. But for me, sometimes having those brush strokes and a little bit of that roughness adds to the character and adds to the sort of the sort of way and the feel that the miniature has to it as well. And again, as you can see, just using the brush strokes, trying to avoid getting the lighter colours into those little holes, into the brittle points and into the areas there. And that should be it for the bone colours and for the dragon in that way. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to focus entirely on the armour. We're going to do pretty much the same thing we did for Neferata. So I'm just starting out by using the heavy charcoal just to get the armour to match up, because we've got all those amazing colours. We don't want to go too over the top and paint the armour a really bright colour, because it's going to detract from everything that we've done. So we're going to try and mute these colours down, make these nice and dark, and keep that contrast, you know? So we start with our heavy charcoal, then again with the Retributor armour just for the trim and just for the edges, as you can see here. Just trying to take my time. Again, it doesn't matter if you make any mistakes at this stage. It's easy to fix and to repair. So don't worry too much if you go a little bit awry, because you can always fix it with a little bit of heavy charcoal again. And then we're going again with the bone white just across the bones, across the top edge here. And of course we're going to use that bone white as well across the bones on the top part of the armour as well, so on the helmet of the Bonedragon as well. And this again is just about trying to tie this into Neferata, because with this one, although we're using the bone white again, we're going to use a null oil shade, so the armour on the dragon will tie into Neferata more than the colours on the dragon, so should have a little bit of a separation as well. And just using the gunmetal on the tassels like before, doing the same thing as what we had done previously. And as I was just saying, using the nulled oil wash then, just to wash everything down and to get the darker shade into all of those recess points and into all of those little nooks and crannies and crevices and things like that. So you just want to cover the armoured part of the miniature. And again, trying to avoid the bones that we've already painted and the skulls and anything like that as well. So just trying to be as careful as possible. Now, being as we are big fans at the moment of doing the stippling effect and getting more of a rough sort of battered feel out of this, we're going in with that heavy charcoal straight away. And we're just going to use, as you can see, one of my more worn brushes, one of my more favourite sort of stippling brushes. As you can see, those bristles are separated apart, and that makes it perfect for doing the stippling effect. Now, once we've done the first layer of the stippling, we're then moving on with the next one, and that's going to be the heavy charcoal and the sombre grey that we used earlier as well, because that's going to be a more natural transition into the highlight on this model. Now, once we've waited for the stippling to dry, we're just going to use that sombre grey, and we're using that as an edge highlight like we did with Neferata's armour. So as I said, just tying the dragon into Neferata so that they have this similarity. So all those bones and the ghostly bits are what's going to stand out on the dragon, while the armour and things is going to tie it into Neferata herself. So I'm just using this on the very extreme edges, and again, this is nice and thin, so as it dries, it's going to dry a little bit darker than how you see it originally. And then we're going to do the same thing, just adding the Retributor armour back on, and I'm just catching the rivets as well across the armour, because again, having that really nice sort of bright, vibrant gold is going to really sort of like catch your eye on the model as well, and catch your eye on the miniature as much as we can. And then we're moving on to using something completely new to me. So this is brand new, and we're using medium rust deposits from AK Interactive. And I had painted the blades originally using just the gunmetals, the basic colour. And I'm just adding this rust colour onto the blades. And that's all you really need to do. I mean, you can go around the edges with a silver again, should you want to. But I found that because the AK rust deposits actually dries into quite a powdery sort of effect, it actually makes it really easy to manipulate, so you can kind of see some of the silver from underneath anyway. So I didn't really have to do too much to it to kind of get the effect that I was looking for. And then we're just moving on and building up those colours again. So whereas we've done the armour, we're now just doing that bone white again. And we're just doing that bone white across the top. And again, like I say, this is all about tying that dragon and that dragon's helmet directly into the same colours that we've got on Neferata. And it's all about tying them together. So while the helmet and the armour and things like that all tie into her, the dragon's bones and skulls and things are all of its own then. And in the same way, as I said, using that elfic flesh once more, just to get those highlights, using those scratchy, individual sort of brush strokes to kind of give it a little bit more of a worn effect, and just being very, very careful not to get this on any of the other bits. But this is nice and easy. This is very, very thin layer brush, as you can see, my very detailed brush, and I'm just catching some of the edges just to make the edges pop on that armour. And in the same way, what you can do to get those sort of claws to look a little bit different, obviously the shade and the wash has sort of dried down on there, so you can move back then to the khaki, and just on the top part of the claws, if you use sort of just the very tip of the brush and just pull that across in a few different sort of brush strokes, leaving some of that shade underneath, we're going to kind of build the effect and build the illusion that the claw has got a few sort of rivets and a few ridges in the claw. Again, add into some of the depth, add into some of the sort of character and things that come out of the model that way. So as you can see, just using the very tip of the brush, just kind of dragging the paint up, trying to kind of create some rivets and some edges through the claws like this, just kind of giving it a little bit more depth, as I say. You could do that to all of the claws and things, and once you're at that stage then, just mix in with that khaki, a little bit of the bone white, so a little bit of that cream white, and as you can see now, just using the very tip of the brush again, creating more of those ridges, more of those sort of flicked through effects with the very tip of the brush, just kind of creating those ridges, just like so. And again, once that dries down, that's going to look really, really cool. It's going to add more to the character because the claws are going to look very separate and very different to the bones and things like that, and the colours are going to make it a little bit different and just separate it. And then for one of the final touches, if not the final touch, we're just going to move on to a citadel, and this is a technical paint, and you don't have to use this if you don't. If you're happy keeping everything silver, you can, but the reason why I painted the gems silver originally is because it's kind of a little bit of a cheat. You paint the gems silver so that when you put your spirit stone or your technical paint on top, it actually shows the silver, or it glows through, so you kind of get, with your technical paint, your technical paint becomes shiny, kind of like jewels and things like that. It's not like a non-metallic metal, but it's a very quick and easy cheating kind of way of getting gems and gemstones. So all of her gemstones then look red. And there we go, I've based her up as well by using some really cool little bits of glass, a tiny tree that I picked up off a cheap tree pack from Amazon. And there she is. Now that everything's dry, she looks really, really good. This is the only way that I could display her because she's too big to fit into my light box. And as you can see, it's an awful day outside as well, so it's the perfect day for painting. There is one subtle difference you might notice, and that's that the spirits are green now, and that's because I've tested something else, which I'll put into a different video for you at another time, and that is by using glow pigments to get those spirits to glow in the dark. But that's for another video. As always, my friends, thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you for watching, and thank you for your support.